thank you very much for having me here. And it's, I think, a really exciting topic. I didn't actually, when I was in my previous jobs in DC and in Chicago, we always worked on freight-related issues, but it was never quite at the forefront that it has been here in Seattle. And as I got to Seattle and I learned about the city's history, I really started to understand why. So we're the most trade-dependent state in the country, which is a factoid that I learned after I got here, which is now everywhere I go, I see it. But it's really, that's built on a long and strong history here in the city. We started really in a trade, as a trade city with sending timber down to San Francisco to build all the beautiful Victorians. And then we started, or we were outfitting the Klondike Gold Rush as well. And one of the things that I learned as I was preparing a presentation for all of my peers at the NACTO conference a couple weeks ago was that UPS actually started here in Seattle, which I did not realize. The American Parcel Service started here and then sort of grew from here to Oakland and then into Chicago and New York. So it's a big global company that changed supply chain logistics around the world, and it started right here. And we really continue to be at the forefront. So when I think about transportation here in Seattle, there's one thing that I think dominates, and it doesn't take a transportation expert or a transportation director, which are two different things if you talk to the people that I work for and with and who work for me, they might call that into question. But I think the one overriding thing facing Seattle right now is growth. And I think that as I go through this PowerPoint, I think there's a lot of commonalities that Seattle is experiencing with other big cities. So we're growing at about 2.5% a year. At any given time, we have 50 to 60 cranes in the city. The vast majority of them are in the center city, but you see them kind of throughout. Almost every urban village, every dense residential neighborhood throughout the city, you'll see cranes. And that's really changing the nature of movement within the city. It's changing the way our neighborhoods look and feel, but it's also changing the way people move around the city and the way we need people to move around the city. So one of my favorite, one of the reasons that I got into transportation was actually I wanted to get into economic development, and because I liked cities and I wanted to figure out how to make more of them. And I realized that I could get into, there was lots of different paths to do that, and I kind of like had this epiphany at some point in my probably senior year in high school or freshman year in college that I wanted to get into transportation, because without a strong transportation system, particularly without a strong transit system, you couldn't really have big dense cities. And so what is all this growth meaning for Seattle is that this graph I think pretty much sums it up. It's probably a little bit simplistic, but I think it really paints a very vivid picture, which is this is just for downtown. We're going to be adding over the next 20 years about 60,000 jobs into downtown. And we're going to have to figure out some way to move all those people. So if you look at the bottom, sort of the salmon-colored part of the bar, that's people getting into downtown by driving alone. And the blue is people walking, biking, taking transit, carpooling. And so fast forward 20 years, 60,000 new employees. That's actually, I suspect, quite conservative. If you were to look at what Amazon is planning for and building for, there's 30,000 of those in the next 5 years, give or take. They wouldn't give me their actual number, but that's about, in terms of square footage, about what it means. So how are we going to move all of those people around and into the city? And that's just downtown, but the same story is happening throughout the city and throughout the region. And a lot of times when you read about the work that SDOT's doing or the government's doing around transportation, you'll hear about this kind of war on cars or these different modes fighting each other. This is actually not a photo of Seattle, but I think it illustrates a very good point, which is that we have all these different modes competing for right-of-way. And for the future of Seattle, if we want to move people, really like freight and transit, there's no bigger friend to freight and logistics right now than transit. The more people we can get on buses, the more people that we can get on light rail, the more people we can get walking, the more people we can get biking, the better it's going to be for freight mobility. We're having a conversation right now that Brian Surratt, the head of the Office of Economic Development for the city, is leading with a lot of folks in the real estate community, in the development community, and also in the industrial community about what is the future of our industrial lands. How do we have the growth that we're seeing in the technology sector and the office market coexist with our freight and industrial community, because both are really valuable, both help provide a very diversified economy, but how do we balance that future? And I think good transit and smart freight are very, very complementary. We also have, as we're getting denser, right, we're trying to use our streets not just for moving things, but creating vibrant communities. So, we have sidewalk cafes, we have streeteries, we have parklets, we have play streets where you can, take your residential street and turn it into, do basically a block party. We will, have farmers markets, right? So we're using all of our streets for very, very different purposes all the time. Sometimes it's about moving things, sometimes it's about creating a sense of place. But as that's going on, we also need to be cognizant that when you're sitting at a sidewalk cafe having a burger and beer, or fish and chips in this case, you might say like tofu and kombucha. Like everything needs to get there in some way or another. And this graphic is from our Freight Master Plan. And what it shows is that, all of those things that you're eating and consuming got there in some way. And they came across vast distances in lots of different modes. So if you have fish, that's coming in through the fisherman's terminal, and then it's going to be sitting in cold storage. Your beer, you have hops coming in from the Yakima Valley, and malts coming in from Vancouver, and then it's going to a brewery in Georgetown, or a brewery in Ballard, or a brewery in the Central District, or a brewery in pretty much any neighborhood in the city, getting brewed, and then getting delivered to a sidewalk cafe if you're not actually consuming it at the brewery with a food truck pulling up to give you food. So lots of freight needs to move locally, what I would call intra-city freight. So you have intercity freight, intra-city freight, needs to move to that sidewalk cafe so that you can enjoy your vibrant community. So with that in mind, we're working with the port. We had the levy to move Seattle that passed 9 years, $930 million. And so with that, we're working really hard on first mile and last mile connections, whether it's the Lander Street overpass, which is a great, really important connection in the port, provides a lot of reliability because we have freight and commuter rail that's moving north and south that's going to be cutting off access between those two parts of through SoDo for, it could be as much as 10 to 12 hours a day with trains crossing it. So we need to provide reliable transportation across that. East Marginal Way, we're going to be working on a reconstruction and repaving project for that stretch of road, working on a heavy haul network, and then a freight spot improvement program as well. But then at the same time, we need to be, we're planning for local freight as well. And so that's really, we recently passed our Freight Master Plan, which has a whole host of different strategies and actions, whether it's specific projects or recommendations like developing an urban goods movement strategy so that we can help move goods into, out of, and within Seattle. And then I think this is where it's really getting, we're in this moment of incredible change within the industry of transportation. A lot of it's being driven by non-transportation related things. So you have Uber and Lyft, obviously, but also Amazon and online shopping. I don't need to, I'm not going to enlighten this group by saying how much that's changing this world, but I'm going to try. So I have this guy that works for me. It's like this fantastic story of how does retail change transportation? Or the change in retail, how is that changing transportation? And it's his story of how he went about buying a new guitar. So he's a guitarist, and probably the last time he bought his guitar 15, 20 years ago, his approach was he was going to go to a bunch of different guitar stores and play a bunch of different kinds of guitars so that he could pick out the right guitar. And then when he was all done, he was going to make one last trip to probably the first store he went to buy a guitar. So now he's buying a new guitar. He bought it a couple years ago. And his new way of buying a guitar was he went online, read all the reviews for all the different kinds of guitars that he wanted to consider. Then he went to one place, played it, and bought it, right? And so what was going to be 7 or 8 trips is now one trip. You know, right now, a lot of times, Best Buy has changed their, I have a friend that was a consultant for Best Buy. They came up with a unique SKU number because basically what was happening is people were going to Best Buy to look at the shape and the size of the TV, and then they would copy down the SKU and then go online and find the best deal, right? So the number of shopping trips that are being made is changing. Where people are going to make those shopping trips are changing. I do most of my shopping in a coffee shop, right? I like walk to the coffee shop and I order all my stuff and it gets delivered, and now it can get delivered in an hour. And so that's changing how developers are thinking about designing buildings for goods drop-off. It's also kind of coming full circle where Amazon is now building a drive-through store in Ballard, which I'm a little concerned about, but something that they get to do. And then I think this is something that that I think cities are going to be increasingly dealing with, which is what is the best use of curb space? We typically, you know, anytime the city tries to remove parking, it leads to a huge outcry from people that are in that business district or trying to access that business district. And that's made things really, it makes things really challenging for some of the other missions that we're trying, or some of the other missions that we're trying to achieve as a transportation department. But I recently had this really amazing conversation with a downtown real estate developer where we were talking about putting in a bike lane, and we could put it on this side of the street or we could put it on that side of the street. And one side of the street was going to remove loading zones and the other side of the street was going to remove parking. And his feedback was, you know, I'd really much rather have you eliminate parking because I can't get rid of my loading zone. I've got too many people getting picked up with Uber and Lyft, right? Which, you know, we're getting to this point where what is the best use of our curb space, and what's the difference between picking up and dropping off a person, picking up and dropping off a package? There's not a whole lot of difference, and you have some services that are trying to do both with the same vehicle. And so how we think about that first 50 feet and the last 50 feet in the supply chain is really changing for cities, and how we treat that curb space. Because parking traditionally has been, we have a parking policy in the city where we try to maintain 1 to 2 spaces per block face available at all times. And I suspect that each of you would challenge whether we're actually meeting that goal, which is acceptable feedback, or I think accurate feedback. But that's our goal. And we're doing that we don't view parking as a revenue generator. What we view it as is a way to improve access to businesses, improve access to goods and services. And I think this first 50 feet, last 50 feet is really, I think, changing the way people or cities think about how they use their curb space for parking or for loading. And so I'm really excited to announce that we're going to be partnering with UW on evaluating exactly this question, this first 50 feet and last 50 feet. And I think, you know, the work is really critical for us locally trying to figure that out. It's really relevant nationally. Every city is dealing with it. And I would argue globally, when we held our national conference here in Seattle last week, I would say that, you know, parking is the new black in transportation, and curb space is the new black. It's really what a lot of the intellectual energy with my peers is focused on. So thank you very much.
Time for some questions and answers.
Sure, I'm happy.
For a minute or two?
Yeah, right now?
Yeah, right now.
Yeah, absolutely.
Absolutely, right.
Sure.
So, I'll let you, since you have the mic and you can control.
Oh.
Yeah.
Yes.
We think this room has got pretty good sound, so we're going to ask you to stand, introduce yourself by name, your affiliation, organization, or company, or as a student, and Scott says he'll be willing to take a few questions.
Yep. Any questions you guys have? Okay.
Alan Van Bowen, Consultant. What do you see, what trends do you see in autonomous vehicles and how might they affect some of the longer range planning?
Oh, that's a very good question. So Mark probably has some thoughts on this as well. Hopefully we're in agreement, but who knows? I think the autonomous vehicles are going to be really, there's kind of like there's utopian and dystopian kind of views of how they're going to shake out, and I think it's probably going to be somewhere in between. Some research that recently came out of some mid-sized European cities that were modeling what the impact was going to be suggested that a lot of it was going to be dependent on the ownership model that evolved. With shared fleets, you see some increase in VMT, but not a ton. But you see a lot lower vehicle ownership. And if the ownership model is privately owned autonomous vehicles, AVs, then you'll have a pretty significant increase in vehicle miles traveled. Mark has this nightmarish scenario in which I own my car, I own my autonomous vehicle, and I don't want to pay for downtown parking, so I have it go around all over the place and run my errands for me. So I think that's a dystopian future. I think that there's a huge land use component to it. I think there's questions around right-of-way allocation and how loading and unloading works. And the other things that I think a lot about, and this is a little bit disjointed, but I think a lot about what it means for the pedestrian environment. So, we could probably move cars through downtown very quickly with autonomous vehicles, 30, 40 miles an hour, and have it be plenty safe, but is that a place that you're going to want to sit down at a sidewalk cafe at? Or, how are you going to feel as a pedestrian crossing the street? The thing that I think about most is really the financial impacts. If we go to an shared fleet model, two things likely shake out. One is total cost of ownership pushes shared fleets to EVs. And so that's going to have a big impact on gas tax receipts. And then likely also parking demand drops quite a bit. And that will hit the city. So the gas tax is state and federal. And at the city level, we'll start seeing declining parking revenues and declining parking tax revenues, which just means that we'll need to figure out a different way to pay for infrastructure. The parking tax is really interesting because right now we do a lot of long-term debt based on parking tax revenue. And you could imagine that 5, 10, 15 years from now, depending on when they arrive and depending on how fast the market takes them up, that it could really catch folks by surprise. So I think there's going to be a conversation about how to price them. I think we should be doing that now. I was talking to somebody from Sidewalk Labs, which is Google's urban venture, and their thought was we should really be talking about how we tax empty seats in autonomous vehicles so that we can encourage shared fleets and encourage shared use and reduce empty deadheading. And right now, there's not really a built-in constituency to fight that, so it's kind of the perfect time to start. It's like if you had the chance to set up the gas tax in like 1870 before anybody thought about what the implications were, and before there was a built-in constituency, that'd probably be the right time.
Could you restate the question, our videographer?
Oh, sure. So the question was really, what are the impacts or how are we planning for autonomous vehicles?
Yeah, I lived in Europe for a number of years. I've heard Rick Steves, who's a local travel guru, travel all around the world a lot. He talked about putting parking areas outside of the city and having easy access for transit from those parking areas around the city into the city. I'm curious if you guys have thought
So, generally speaking, for SDOT, so the question was really around, are there peripheral park and rides, and then pushing or encouraging folks to take transit into the center city. I think as Link builds out, there's going to be a lot of energy in the more suburban locations to do park and rides. Within the city, I think we have a policy that we would rather have folks walking, biking to transit, and living close to transit. So for those scarce asset or scarce real estate around transit stations, really focusing on creating buildings for offices or retail or housing versus park and rides. But with an autonomous fleet, I think it's actually an interesting question to ask yourself. So there's always going to be very, very peaked demand for vehicles and travel. And so is there a need to create kind of peripheral parking facilities for shared, for those autonomous vehicles so that they're not, gunking out the center city, in the middle of the day?
Hi, Scott. My name is Maria Ross, and I'm the Transportation Policy Analyst for the Washington Policy Center. Very nice to meet you. I wanted to talk a little bit more about your comment on getting people on public transit and the relation to freight mobility.
Mm-hmm.
So both PSRC and Sound Transit data reflects that public transit, although it's an alternative to traffic congestion, does not necessarily have a significant impact on traffic congestion for the majority of folks in the region. So can you elaborate on how public transit, as you see it, would have an impact on freight mobility if there is a low impact on traffic congestion?
So I don't know the answer. I don't know that anybody knows the perfect answer to that. I think, one thing that you could see is in areas like SoDo, you could see shared freight and transit lanes, or you could say, we have a transit lane that's functioning for transit and buses in the peak, in the AM and PM peak, but in the midday when there's still a lot of travel, it could be for freight, right? Or you could, that in industrial areas, you could make that argument, or not make that argument, but build the case for that type of investment. I think that a lot of what we're trying to do from a transit perspective is get as many people on it as possible and build dedicated transit facilities so this is as attractive as possible to get on transit. In any dense built environment, you're always going to have congestion, right? That's just sort of the nature of it. So the other thing that we want to do is invest in reliability. So if you take Mercer as an example of a corridor and look at kind of what the free flow speed is versus what the average speed is versus what the planning speed is, and so I'm in a room full of students and engineers and whatnot. So like the free flow speed is, if everything is working, that's how fast it's going to take to get down Mercer. The mean speed is just, it's the average speed. It's exactly what it says it is. And the planned speed is really your second two standard deviations away from the mean, right? And so it's a measure of reliability. So Mercer, I think your free flow speed from east to west is probably 12 minutes or thereabouts, if I'm remembering correctly. Your mean speed might be 15 to 18, and your planning speed is 30 to, 30 plus minutes, like 30 to 32 if you're heading eastbound. So I would argue that, we're probably never going to achieve free flow travel speed in the peak, but to the extent that we can bring that mean and the planning speed closer together, it builds in reliability, which is, I think, as much as anything, probably the thing that we should be focusing on.
One more question.
Sure.
Hi, my name's Anna Bolgia. I'm a master's student in research assistant at the SCTL Center. I'm interested in hearing more about, talk about placemaking versus access.
Mhm.
Kind of the balance between the two. How do you see going forward that this is going to be allocated or works through this?
So the question being the placemaking versus access for freight and goods. I don't know. I think that one of the things that I think that we'll need to get used to is that we're growing into a big city, and big cities are messy and chaotic places, and you know, all these different things need to move and work together. I was just in San Francisco yesterday, and I was in an alley, and there was a bunch of restaurants that were opening out onto the alley, right? But then they had gates because then on the alley. So then at night you can roll up all the restaurants and deliver all the goods. And so I think trying to figure out how to think both spatially and temporally when it comes to how we use our public space is going to be really critical as we grow, because there's going to be all the different demands on them are complementary. So if you are sitting at a sidewalk cafe and can't get a sandwich, you're probably not going to be sitting there, right? So you need to figure out how to get the sandwich there, but maybe it's, maybe it's restricted delivery to nighttime. I look up at Capitol Hill and the Pike Pine corridor, and I find it kind of fascinating that, you know, people are basically using that middle lane as a delivery, loading and unloading. I don't know what my traffic engineer would think about that, but I am not a traffic engineer, but I look at it and I say, well, this is actually a pretty good use of space. It's, you know, it's a mid-block, 10-foot wide piece of space where we can load and unload. It's going to have the natural effect of slowing traffic down, which is going to make for a more pedestrian-friendly environment, and it's going to put less pressure on the curb space. So I kind of look at creative uses of that right of way and kind of recognizing that we're not all going to have our own space. We're going to have to figure out how to share it, I think is going to be how we balance that.
Thank you.
Cool, thank you.
What a smart guy to have at the top
Thank
of the
you.
heap. We're really pleased to
Thank
have
you.
We have a small gift, which,
Oh, excellent.
it's very small. It's under $50. It's
Excellent.
only once a year.
Oh, I appreciate that.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.